Hey class. In this video, we're going to be introducing Godot, which is the game engine that we'll be using to create games this semester. The pronunciation I'm pretty sure is Godot, not Godot, but either way, I think is fine. I'll understand what you're talking about. It's an open source and free and cross-platform game engine, which are a bunch of good reasons to use it. It's also very lightweight, and so all those factors make it very accessible. So it is going to work pretty much the same on a Mac or a Windows, on a laptop or a desktop or a Linux machine. Whatever you happen to be using, I think the program should work pretty well. I also really like Godot in terms of its interface and the way that it treats different concepts in game development. I think it's very visual and it's very easy to learn as a beginner. And so that makes it a great platform for a class like this, where we're all basically starting as beginners or starting from scratch. It's also great for indie game development. There's a lot of people who use it. There's a lot of documentation. It's been around for a while now. You may have heard of other game engines like Unity or Unreal or GameMaker. Those are all great products and are worth exploring in your own time. If you have questions, I could probably answer questions about those as well. Here's the lab that we're working on in this video. So there's a bunch of steps, but they're all pretty straightforward. We're going to start just by downloading the engine and creating a basic scene. We're going to go over folder organization, creating a scene inside the game, adding some sprites, adding a player, and setting up the input, and then ultimately previewing the scene. So there's a bunch of steps here, but they're all really straightforward. This is really just like a beginner thing where we're just going to be looking at the interface and all the little basic things that make it work. So we're going to create a really simple scene where we're just going to add the avatar that we created in the previous lab into a scene and make it move around. Nothing too crazy, but just kind of a light intro to the game engine. So regardless if you're planning on focusing on development or designing or art, you are gonna be using the Godot engine a lot, even if you're not actually writing code. Godot is the thing that's gonna organize all of the other assets like art and sound and programming that we put together to make the game work. So everybody's going to be using it. So let's get started. Of course, the first thing we wanna do is download the Godot application. Click on the download link, and then choose your operating system. Could be Mac, Windows, or Linux. Download the standard version for now, and that'll take a second to download. Let's skip ahead, and then it's gonna unzip, and it should just show up in your downloads folder. You can actually just throw Godot right on your desktop and run it from there. It's a standalone application, so it doesn't really matter where you put it, but I like to have things nice and organized, so I'm gonna put it in my applications folder. And then I'm gonna open it up just using the spotlight. You might get a warning since it's an indie developer. You can just hit open, and it should work. So I'm gonna go ahead and download some files that I added to the lab that are down here. They don't come up until a little bit later, but I'm gonna go ahead and download them now that we're on the website, so we'll have them. It's gonna download a zip file. My Mac automatically unzipped it, so you can see the files there. If you're on a Windows or that doesn't happen, you may need to right click and extract those files. For now, I'm just gonna leave them in my downloads folder, and when we get to that step later, we will put them into our project folder. So now that we have Godot open, we're gonna start by creating a new project. We're not always gonna create new projects for every lab, but this is a good way to go over some of the basics of the interface. So first we want to name the project and then choose where it's gonna go on our desktop. So we want to create a folder for the new project. So we'll just call it Godot Intro, and then select current folder. And then we're also going to choose OpenGL ES2. So it says lower quality visuals, but this is actually going to be good for us since we're going to be using pixel art to begin. It's going to work better for us. So now let's take a look at the Godot interface and the files that were just created. So in the bottom left, the file system panel, you can see some files that were just created when we created our new project. There's some environmental variables that we don't really have to worry about. That's what that looks like. There's an icon. We'll eventually replace that. But basically, that file system down on the left is a little window into the files on our computer that we can use as we're creating our game. Next, let's take a look at some different interface layouts. So under the editor, you're going to see the editor layout, and this is the default layout where you see the file system bottom left, the scene view in the top left, and the inspector on the right. This is a fine view. I change it sometimes depending on the project that I work on. You can see that it's very customizable. I can move things around, make things bigger or smaller, and then I can go back to the default. So in these videos, I'll be using the default layout. If you want to play with the layout and try different things, you should do that, and maybe you'll find something that works good for you. Let's look at the file system panel first. So this is where we can see all our files, and we want to make sure that things are very organized. It's going to make it a lot easier to work as our projects become more and more complex. So let's create some folders to manage our assets. So to start, we'll add a scripts folder for all of our code, a scenes folder for our different scenes, and then a sprites folder for our art. And these are our three basic folders. We're gonna add some more stuff in the future, but for now, this is everything we need. So we can see it actually adds those folders onto our desktop, and we can put the files we downloaded earlier into the scripts and sprites folder. So the images should go into the sprites folder, and the code, the .gd scripts, the player controller and the camera controller, go into the sprites menu. In the top left corner, you'll find the scene view. This is where we're gonna add scenes to our game. So we can start creating a new scene by clicking the 2D node and then calling this the default scene. So then the window in the middle is our scene viewer, and we can move around there using the mouse. It's helpful to have a mouse with a scroll wheel so that you can zoom in and out. But it's not necessary. There are other tools to do that. On my mouse, the scroll wheel is also a third button. So when I click and move with the scroll wheel, that pans the view. And you can use a little hand tool to do that as well. So let's save that scene. You can see that asterisk in the tab means that the scene is unsaved. So if you ever see that, you need to save. So you can hit Command S or Control S or go to Scene, Save Scene. We're gonna make sure to choose the scenes folder and call it default scene. And now it will show up in the scenes folder. And if we look in our Finder, we can see that it appears in the scenes folder on our computer. Since we have our scene, let's add some stuff into it. So we're gonna start by adding a node using the plus button. We wanna start with a node 2D. The easiest way to find the node that you're looking for is to use the search bar at the top of the menu. You can type in the node if you know what it's called. I'm looking for a node 2D, which is basically just a generic node that doesn't have any inherent properties. But there are other nodes like a sprite that we'll add later that have specific properties that come with them. Once you find the node, select it and then hit enter or click the create button. This is basically like just adding another folder. Another way to add a node is to right click on the node that you want to add it to and click add node. So once we create this new node, I'm going to call it scenery, and then I'm going to hit the plus again and add a sprite. A sprite is what it sounds like. It contains a texture, some visual that we see on the canvas of the scene. So to add a sprite, we go over to the inspector and click on that texture and then find the sprite that we want to add. I'm going to add the tree from the download. You can add your own image if you like. So if we scroll in, we can now see that the tree is on our canvas, but it looks kind of blurry. So this is a bit of a tangent, but if we want our sprites not to be blurry, since they are pixel art, we don't want the program to filter them. So if we turn filter off and then re-import it, now you see we get these hard edges that we expect from pixel art. And to make things a little bit easier, if you go into project settings and go over to import defaults and then go to texture, you could make sure that all textures are imported without filtering turned on. And so now you don't really have to worry about that happening in the future. Now that we have the sprite node, we can duplicate it and then we can make a copy and move it around. So we can start to make our forest or design our game. And we can also select both of our trees and duplicate those if we want to do it a little more efficiently. And so you can see you could start to design by moving stuff around. So now that we've built out a little scene, let's talk about how Godot thinks about the structure of a game. In Godot, we have this thing called the node hierarchy, or the game structure is essentially a bunch of information that tells the game where to put different files and assets. You can think of the node hierarchy like an HTML document if you've ever taken a web development class. You have the HTML node, and then inside you have the head and the body, and inside of the body you might have a nav and a container and some paragraphs and some other things. So it's a very similar style of architecture for a game as for a website. So the hierarchy is used to reference our assets and to organize them into scenes. Our assets contain things like our scripts and our scenes themselves and our art and sound and all the things that go into making a game. The reason that we have these things separate is so that we can reuse sprites like we did with the trees and reuse scripts and keep everything nice and organized so that it runs efficiently. A lot of these structures are designed so that the computer doesn't have to work as hard in order to play the game, so we get a good frame rate while we're playing to make the game work and feel immersive. So we have the root node, and connected to the root node we have our scene. So we have a default scene, and that has its own hierarchy inside of it. And then we might have another scene like level 1 or game over. The default scene is going to have some scenery, and inside of the scenery we have all of the trees that we just created. And this is how Godot organizes everything in the scene. Each one of those references is actually a reference to the graphic. So it just tells the computer where to draw all the pixels in that graphic. The scene is also a reference to the default scene, and we can also put scenes inside of other scenes. Eventually we'll also add the player as a separate scene, and it will have its own script and its own sprite. Now let's go over some of the basic tools in our scene window. If you hover over any of the tools, you'll see what they do, and you will also see a key command to select the tool. So the main tool is just the selection tool. You just select different objects. The move tool will move any object in the scene. Notice that I can't select other objects when I'm using the move tool. The rotate tool rotates. Again, I have to get the selection tool to choose other objects if I want to rotate them. Each of the tools has its own key command, which makes it easier to move in between tools, especially if you're moving in between selection and the transformation tools. So Q will give you selection, W will give you move, E for rotate, and S for scale. The next tool is the list tool. This is only really relevant if you've got a whole bunch of things stacked up next to each other. That happens a lot when you're designing. This will let you choose which one you want to move or select. So you need to choose it and then switch to another tool and then move it. So that'll be useful as our scenes get more complex. The next tool moves the pivot point for rotations. So you can see when I move the pivot point and then rotate, instead of rotating around the center, it rotates around the point where I moved it. The hand tool moves the whole canvas. Snapping tool turns on the grid, and it is going to snap the origin of your sprite to a position on the grid. So that can be useful for doing a design. You can also change the snap size. So if I go to 16 by 16, you'll see the pixels, you'll see the grid gets larger. And so the areas where I can snap to are fewer. And so I can organize my scene by using that grid. The lock and selection tool make it so that I can't select or move a object in the scene. That'll also get very useful as our scenes start to get more complex. You may want to avoid moving something unintentionally, so you can lock it and turn off the ability to be selected. So those two icons usually go together. For now, we're going to ignore the last three tools, the skeleton and the view and the camera tool. They're not going to be relevant for this. So the last panel we'll take a look at is the inspector panel on the right. We'll go into more depth in future videos. So the inspector panel will show you all the properties related to a specific node. So we already added the texture. There's other properties like the offset, change by dragging back and forth or setting a number. You can also hold shift to drag slowly or hold control to drag more quickly through the numbers. There's also flip H, which just flips the art, or flip V, flip vertical. The animation area we're not going to deal with right now, or the region area. The transform is the position, the scale, and the rotation of the object. So we can change the position manually, we can rotate manually, we can scale the object using these values. There's also the Z index, which is the depth. So we can change the Z index to make nodes appear on top of each other. Notice that there's also a little icon next to all of the properties that lets you reset them to the default. The visibility menu allows you to change the color. And so I can modulate the color of an object. I can also modulate the color of a node that the object is in. So I can change the color of all the trees or change the trees individually. So that's a really nice way to change the color of different objects and create some variety with the same art. We are going to ignore the rest of these properties. There's one property down at the bottom that we'll use when we create our player for adding a script. Now we're going to create a new scene to add our player. The main reason that we want our player to be in a separate scene is because when we add more scenes, like more levels to the game, we're going to want the same player in each level. And the easiest way to do that is by separating that player into a new scene. So we're going to create a new scene and add a kinematic body 2D. We're not going to go into the physics quite yet, but that's the easiest way to create a player that moves. And you can see it has a player icon. It's designed for a moving player. For our kinematic body 2D, even though we're not going to be using physics quite yet, we do have to give it a collider just so it won't complain. We get these little warnings. And we have to add a collider shape. So we're going to match this with the art. It doesn't have to be perfect because we're not going to be having any collisions in this example. So let's talk a little bit about how scenes work before we build the rest of our scene. So the scene is sort of the basic unit of content in Godot. We can think of scenes as blueprints for objects in our game. So for example, we have a default scene, which we've already created, and that organizes a few things. It has a canvas, which is used to render graphics. It has sprites and objects in the scene. It has a camera, which determines what we see in the scene, and we're going to add that in a little bit. We're also going to add a player scene. And as I mentioned, this is its own mini scene that's going to go inside of the default scene. It's also going to go into all the levels that we create as we build out the game. Right now we have some trees in our scene, and eventually we're going to add other objects. So imagine that we have some coins that we want to collect. So instead of recreating the coin a bunch of times, what we'll do is we'll create a coin scene, which we can then add into our other scenes, just like our player. Eventually we'll add enemies or obstacles, so we could have a bad guy scene, and we can put that into our different levels, and that might appear in our default scene. So we can use the bad guy blueprint to create as many copies as we want. We might even create a very large bad guy later in the game. So we'll use the same bad guy blueprint, but we might do something like multiply the scale to get a larger, more bad guy. Using scenes makes it a lot easier to create this content without having to build everything from scratch every time we want to add something into the scene. Every time we add in a scene, it's called an instance. So an instance of a scene is the object that gets added into the game based on that blueprint. So now let's get our art. So I'm going to grab the peanut butter and jelly avatar that I made in my art lab example. I'm just going to copy that and throw it into my sprites folder. And so now when I go back to the sprites folder, there's my peanut butter and jelly, and I can add that. So now let's add a sprite for our art. So we can add in the sprite and then add the texture, click on load, and find our avatar. And that looks pretty good. I went ahead and matched the collider, but you really don't need to do this because we're not using physics in this example. Now we can attach a script to our player. So we want to choose the kinematic body node and then go to the script and click load. And you're going to add the script that you downloaded called PlayerController. And that's going to add a little icon. You can see that looks like a little scroll. And if you click on that, it'll show you the actual code. And so we're almost done. Let's just rename this kinematic body to player. So that's how it'll show up when we import it into our scene. Notice that the script adds script variables. We'll take a look at what those do. So back in our default scene, we want to add a child scene. So instead of hitting the plus button, we're going to hit that link button and just find the scene and click add. You'll notice there's a couple icons. The little scene button brings us back to the scene, so we can go edit it. And then the script icon, of course, goes and looks at our code. So we can move our player around in the scene. And if we try to play the scene, nothing's going to happen because we haven't actually set up the input yet. And you might notice there's a bunch of errors in the debugger, And that's what happens when our code isn't set up correctly. That's because we have to tell Godot what we want to happen when we press different keys. So in order to set that up, we'll go to Project Settings and go to Input Map. And there's a bar at the top that says Action, and we can type in. So we want to make sure this matches the code. So do move_right. If you want to change that in the code, you can. That's just what I wrote. And then we're going to add a few more keys: move left, move up, move down. So type in the name of the action and then click Add. We can collapse these to make it easier to see. So we have move right. That's just what I wrote in the code. You could change that if you wanted to, but in order for the code that you downloaded to work, you'll have to use the same syntax. So move right, move left, move up, and move down. Once you have the action, you can click the plus button to add a key that you want to do that action. Be careful, because if you hit enter, it's going to change the key that you chose to enter. So you have to use the mouse and click OK after pressing the key. So we're going to use right or D for move right. We'll use A or left for move left. We'll use W or up for move up. And we'll use S or down for move down. So when we close that, we can play the scene again, and now our sandwich should be able to move. So that's pretty exciting. We can see in our little game preview window that our sandwich can move back and forth and up and down. We can also change the speed. So when I talked about those script variables, those are variables that are exposed to the editor, so we can actually change them. So we can make our sandwich move faster. And we'll be using those a lot in our Godot labs this semester. So now I'm going to add a little bit more scenery so we can see our player moving around a bit more. So now we're going to add a camera into the scene. The camera will control what we actually see so that we can move around the scene in different ways. For the camera, I want to add the camera controller script. Hey guys, so I made a little update here and replaced this part of the video. I realized that Godot has added some parameters to the camera that make it possible to do what we need to do without writing any code at all. So we're going to do a different method here where we parent the camera to the player. This is going to make the camera follow the player. And so it means that we don't have to go over writing a camera controller script. So the first thing we have to do is make sure the current setting on the camera is on. That is what tells Godot to use that camera to render the scene. So you can see if I play the scene as it is, the player moves around, but the camera doesn't follow the player. So to change that, what we can do is drag the camera up and into the player node. So if you drag the camera and then hover over the player, it will make the camera a child of the player. And that means that the camera will follow the player wherever it goes. So this does a lot of work for us. I'm going to quickly just rearrange the scene a little bit since we've changed the position of the camera. And so I'm going to reset the position of the camera to match the player and just set everything to 0, 0, and then move the scenery to match that as well. Now when I play the scene, you'll see that the camera follows the player, and basically anywhere the player moves, the camera moves along. So we change the view of the scene that we get from the camera. So there's a few parameters that we can change with the camera to change the effect that we get. One of those is the drag margin. This means that the camera is going to wait for the player to get a little bit farther away before it starts to follow. And we can set how far that margin is. It's based on the size of the window. So the default is 0.2, and that's 20% of the window size. If we change the left and right to 0.5, now we can see that the player moves a little bit farther before the camera starts to follow. The camera still tracks the player up and down on the vertical axis because we didn't enable the drag margin vertical. Another thing that we can change is the limits of the camera. You can see the default limits are quite large. So that means that the camera will basically follow us virtually as large as we make our scene. But if we change, for example, the top and the bottom limit, now the camera doesn't move at all vertically. It still tracks the player horizontally, however. We can switch the vertical and horizontal, or we can set them both the same way. We can also change the top and left to be a little bit larger. So for example, with our window of 600 pixels, I'm going to make the top -300 and the bottom 300. So that'll give us a little bit of room on the top of the bottom for the player to move and the camera to follow. So you can see now, if I go up and down, it goes a little bit. You can see as I go up and down, the camera follows up until a certain point, at which point the player moves without the camera following. So we can set limits as well as the drag margin for our camera. If we don't want the camera to move at all, but we want it to match where the player is, we can set the top to -150, which is half the margin, so a quarter of the whole height of the window. And now the player will be centered vertically, but the camera will not follow except for on the horizontal axis. So there's a bunch of different settings you can play with for the camera to get the effect that you want. Something like this might be good if you have a RPG style game where the player can explore an area, but you don't want them to go beyond the boundaries. One other parameter is the smoothing. So this will make the camera follow the player in a Bezier curve. So it'll speed up and then slow down a little bit as it follows the player. We can also change the speed of the camera as it follows. So a faster camera will follow faster and snap right behind the player, whereas a slower camera would obviously move a little bit slower. So you can play around with these parameters to get the effect that you want for your game. And the last thing I have to do is take a screenshot for documentation to post on the Open Lab. So I'm going to do that the same way I took a screenshot of my skill tree. On the Mac, I'm going to hit Command-Shift-3 and then hit space to get the camera and take a screenshot of that window. That's going to include the Godot menu bar, which has the name of the scene, and it also says debug because we're still developing our project. So we can see that screenshot on my desktop, and now I just want to post it on the Open Lab. So I'll open up my browser and go to the Open Lab. And to make a new post, as usual, I'll hit the plus button and then click post. And I'll choose a category, Godot Intro, and write a quick title. And I can write a sentence explaining what's happening in the scene. And then I can drag and drop my screenshot, and I need to get that little blue bar in order to drop it in there. And let's take a quick look and preview our post. And that's it. That's all we need for this lab. There is a bonus for this lab if you want to spend a little more time on the scenery and add some more stuff into your scene. And once you post that on the Open Lab, I will get a notification and I will give you feedback as soon as I can.